In a manor wrapped in silence and shadows, a grieving duke watches from a window high above, his heart closed to the world. Below, in a garden overtaken by sorrow and neglect, a maid dances in the rain, holding the hand of her child, a boy whose laughter defies his broken body. In that single fragile moment, something forbidden awakens. Secrets buried beneath stone will rise again. Love will challenge duty, and the past will demand its due. When the storm ends, whose heart will break? Whose truth will set them free? Dear listener, welcome. Tell me, where in the world are you joining us from? And what is it about historical romances that so deeply captures your heart? Norwich, England. Year of our Lord, 1593. A thin mist clung to the grey stone walls of Winthorpe Hall, coiling around its towers and chimneys like a serpent of sorrow. The house stood alone, atop a hill overlooking the city, ancient and brooding, its windows shuttered against a world reeking of death. The plague had come again. It whispered through alleyways, stole into homes without knocking, and carried away mothers, children, bakers and barons alike. Within the hall, silence had taken up permanent residence, thick, suffocating and absolute. The Duke of Winthorpe no longer received visitors. His boots no longer echoed across the marble floors. Servants moved like shadows, heads bowed low, their voices kept in hushed tones, as if even the walls might shatter from the weight of grief that pressed against them. Some said he had gone mad from sorrow, others that he had simply ceased to be. And yet, on this day, as the clouds gathered and the scent of wet earth mingled with the smoke from the kitchen hearth, Alaric Winthorpe stood behind the tall window of the west wing, his hand resting upon the cold stone frame. The glass was fogged from within, blurred at the corners, but his gaze remained fixed, haunted, hollow, searching. Below, in the overgrown garden where weeds now reigned in place of roses, a scene unfolded that did not belong to such a place of mourning. She danced. The maid, no older than 28, twirled barefoot in the soft drizzle, her dark wool skirts heavy with rain, clinging to her legs as she moved. Her hair, usually confined beneath a servant's coif, had slipped free in strands along her cheek. She was not beautiful in the polished sense, not painted nor refined, but there was something in the curve of her smile, the way her eyes lifted to the heavens, that made beauty irrelevant, and beside her, clutching her hand, was a boy, small, fragile, with a twisted right foot that caused him to limp through the puddles. Yet he laughed, a full-bodied, bright laugh that seemed to mock the sorrow of the world. He looked at her as if she were the sun itself, and she returned his gaze with a warmth that set something alight in the Duke's chest, he thought long extinguished. Alaric's hand tightened on the windowsill. She did not know he was watching. She did not know that his soul, dulled by years of silence, had just taken its first breath in what felt like eternity. The rain grew heavier, turning to silver sheets that blurred the edges of the scene. Still she spun, still the child laughed. Their joy was a blasphemy against grief, and yet it was sacred. He closed his eyes. It had been 5 years since his son had died, 5 years since laughter had touched these walls. His fingers, long and pale, trembled as they dropped from the window pane. The ghost of a name formed on his lips, Edward, but it did not pass them. He turned, the cloak at his shoulders falling with a whisper as he retreated from the window, heart pounding with a rhythm unfamiliar and unwanted. That night beneath the manor, where the dampness of the crypt curled around stone and silence, Alaric walked alone. He carried no candle. He needed none. His feet knew the path. He stopped before a small tomb, modest by noble standards but carved with care. He dropped to one knee, fingers tracing the inscription as if it might vanish without touch. Edward Winthorpe, aged 5. His breath hitched. "I saw a boy today," he murmured, voice cracking like frost beneath footfall. "He had your eyes." The rain outside had not ceased, but within those cold walls something had shifted. Not broken, not healed, only stirred. The days at Winthorpe Hall unfolded like a slow dirge, where hours passed, not with the ticking of clocks, but with the creaking of floorboards and the distant murmur of wind pressing against leaded glass. The year was 1593, and though the spring rains had washed the frost from the ground, they had failed to lift the weight that lay heavy over the manor. The Duke no longer walked the halls as he once did, when his footsteps had echoed with certainty and his voice had filled the chambers with command. Now, the servant said he glided like smoke, silent, thin, untouchable. He emerged only in the dimmest hours, drifting like a mournful shade from one shadow to another, vanishing into corners of the estate that others dared not tread. They called him His Grace, with the reverence one reserved for the dead. He had not dined in the great hall in over a year. Meals were left outside his study thrice daily, and trays returned untouched more often than not. His hound, once a loyal companion at his heel, had grown old and half-blind, now lying curled near the hearth in the servants' wing. His horse roamed the stables without saddle or rider, and the portrait of the late Duchess, once displayed prominently above the fireplace in the drawing-room, had been veiled in black cloth, the edges curling from dust and time, but none dared speak of it aloud. Instead, they whispered, in the kitchen, over bread dough and boiling kettles, in the laundry, between linens scrubbed raw, in the scullery, while fingers wrung damp cloths over chipped basins. He watches through the windows now. They say he speaks to no one but the ghost of the boy. I heard his voice in the chapel last night, singing. The younger maids clung to superstition. The older ones knew better. Grief was not always loud. Sometimes it seeped into the marrow and hollowed a man until even his shadow grew thin. And in the midst of all this, Isabel Hartwell moved like a storm barely contained. She had served at Winthorpe Hall for nearly a year, arriving with little more than a carpet bag, a patchwork shawl, and a boy with eyes too wise for 6 years of life. From the start, she kept her head down and her hands busy. She never gossiped, never lingered, and never asked for more than was given. Her child, Thomas, was quiet by nature, but his limp and solemn gaze drew attention no matter how gently she tried to cloak him in invisibility. It wasn't until the rain-soaked morning, when she had allowed herself for the first time a moment of unguarded joy with her son in the abandoned garden, that the house turned its eyes on her. Not all eyes were kind. Mistress Vellum saw to that. A woman forged from iron and vinegar, Vellum had served as housekeeper under the late Duchess and regarded herself as guardian of the hall's fading dignity. She wore her mourning-like armor, starched black gowns, collars that chafed at the throat, and a crucifix that jutted from her chest like a blade. Her voice was low, measured, and cold as the stone that lined the crypts beneath the manor. On the morning after the garden incident, she summoned Isabel to the service corridor, where the scent of lye and damp wool hung thick in the air. No one else lingered. That was intentional. "You will not," Mistress Vellum began, "repeat such displays. This is not a tavern yard. You are a servant of Winthorpe Hall. You will conduct yourself accordingly." Isabel kept her gaze lowered. "Yes, mistress. You have a child under this roof. A privilege not granted to every girl in your position. Best you remember the mercy you've been afforded." A pause, then the blade. "Especially now that His Grace has taken notice." Isabel's eyes lifted, only for a breath's moment. Mistress Vellum's lips pressed together in satisfaction. "A man broken by loss is easily unsettled. Do not invite attention, Miss Hartwell. In this house, attention is the first step toward ruin." Isabel nodded once. Her heart beat heavily beneath her bodice, but her face remained composed. She had known women like Vellum before, women who wielded power from the shadows, whose cruelty was quiet, disciplined, and difficult to name. She had survived worse. She would survive this. Yet as she left the corridor, the words echoed in her chest like distant thunder. "He has taken notice." The thought unsettled her more than it should have. By midday, the tale of the dancing maid had already reached every corner of the hall, retold with varying degrees of contempt or curiosity. Some described her soaked skirts as indecent. Others, with secret admiration, spoke of her laughter as a balm. No one dared ask the Duke directly if he had seen it, and none who valued their position would have ventured near his study to confirm. But the air had shifted. Isabel felt it in the way the scullery maids looked at her, some with envy, others with pity. She felt it in the silence that followed her when she entered a room. She felt it in the steps of Thomas, who clung a little tighter to her hand that evening, as if even he, in his child's heart, sensed the wind beginning to turn. That night, once the lamps were extinguished and the house lay still, Isabel sat at the edge of her son's narrow cot. His face, round with sleep and innocence, rested against her shawl. The candle beside them flickered low, its light carving shadows across the wooden floor. She smoothed the hair from his forehead, fingers lingering where a fever once burned. The scar near her own temple pulsed dully, not from pain, but memory. There had been another house once, another nobleman, another promise broken like glass beneath a boot. She had trusted before, she had paid dearly. She would not repeat that mistake. And yet, she could not forget the feeling of being watched in the garden, not with disdain, not with judgment, but with something else. Something she could not name. A weight not unlike longing. The following morning, Isabel awoke before the bells. Her hands ached from wringing linens and scrubbing floors, but she welcomed the ache. It grounded her. She stepped into her kirtle, tied her apron, and pulled her coif tightly over her hair. In the reflection of the cracked glass above the basin, her eyes met their own gaze, steady, determined. Outside, Norwich breathed beneath grey skies. Smoke curled from chimneys. Rain threatened again, and within Winthorpe Hall, the ghost of a man and the woman he had glimpsed through glass now dwelled under the same roof, circling one another in silence. Two souls bound not by word or touch, but by shadows, by memory, and by the soundless question neither yet dared ask. Not yet, not today. The night had settled heavy over Winthorpe Hall, cloaking its spires and stone galleries in a silence too thick to name. The wind whispered faintly through the upper eaves, brushing past shutters and creaking timbers with the melancholy breath of a memory too long held. No carriages stirred along the muddy road that wound toward Norwich. No visitors dared knock at the great oak doors. The manor, once alive with courtly laughter and music drifting through its chambers, now slumbered in mourning, its soul tucked away behind closed doors and unspoken grief. The hearth in the old library burned low. Only embers glowed there now, casting faint flickers across tapestries faded by time. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with books, many unopened in years, some stacked askew where a servant's cloth had never reached. Dust lingered in the high corners, caught in the carved leaves of the cornices. The scent of ash and old parchment mingled faintly in the air, sweet and sorrowful. Isabel Hartwell stood alone, believing herself unseen. She had come quietly, long after the others had retired, a bucket of coal in one hand, a small broom in the other. It was not her assigned duty, but the maid who tended the library had taken ill, and Mistress Vellum, ever watchful, had barked the order with clipped disdain. "If you're so fond of books and silence," she had said, "go tend to the place where both gather dust." And so Isabel obeyed. She moved softly between the chairs and armoires, her footsteps swallowed by the thick rug that stretched before the hearth. Her kirtle was patched, but clean, the color of moss at dusk. Her sleeves rolled just past her elbows, revealed forearms strong from labor, and her coif was tied neatly over her dark hair. The fire needed stoking, so she knelt before it, brushing the stray ash aside, her profile lit golden by the low flame. She did not hear the door open, nor did she sense the figure that stood in the alcove between the tall shelves, still as a statue, half lit by the candle he carried. Alaric Winthorpe watched her without breath. His steps had brought him here out of habit, perhaps out of memory, or perhaps out of a restlessness he could no longer resist. He had not intended to speak, and yet he did. "You should wear gloves when you tend to embers." Isabel started, her spine stiffening, the coal nearly slipping from her hand. She turned slowly, eyes wide, unsure if the voice had been real or imagined. I did not hear you enter, Your Grace," she said, rising to her feet. Her voice was soft, but steady. She lowered her gaze respectfully. He stepped forward into the firelight. The Duke had not changed since she last saw him, tall, solemn, cloaked in black wool and silence. Yet something about him was different tonight. Less distant, less marble. The flickering light caught the silver near his temples, the shadow beneath his eyes, the fine line of tension that held his mouth still. "You were not meant to," he said simply. Then, more softly, "I startled you. That was not my intention." There was a pause. The room felt smaller now. The heat of the fire, the breath between them, the weight of what should never be said. "I was only here to sweep the hearth," she said. "Mistress Vellum sent me." "I know," he replied. "She dislikes clutter. And you—" That last word struck her with such unexpected frankness that her eyes lifted. For a brief moment they met his, brown to grey-blue, earth to storm. "Do you?" she asked, before she could stop herself. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, more the shadow of a thought. "I don't know you well enough to dislike you, Miss Hartwell." She inclined her head, prepared to step back, to excuse herself, to flee the weight of being seen. But then he spoke again. "May I ask?" His gaze drifted, not cruelly, but with a quiet curiosity. "That scar near your temple, was it recent?" Her hand moved reflexively to the spot. She had stopped noticing it most days. It had become like a knot in an old tree, an imperfection that no longer demanded reflection. And yet now, in his voice, there was no pity, only interest, and something gentler, something she had not expected from a man carved of grief. "No," she said. "It came from a fall, some years ago." She lied without flinching, but her eyes betrayed her. In their depths, something flickered, something clenched. He did not press her. Alaric stepped closer, not enough to breach propriety, but enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his mouth, the silver in his beard. There was warmth beneath the grief. It was faint, but real. "The coals," he said, nodding toward the hearth. "You've missed one." She turned, crouched, placed the final lump in the grate. Sparks flew upward in delicate bursts, painting gold across her cheek. When she rose again, he was watching her, not as a nobleman watches a servant, but as a man watches something he does not fully understand, something that stirs him. "I hope Thomas is well," he said, the boy's name a tremor on his tongue. Isabel's breath caught. "He is, thank you. I saw him once, in the garden." "I know," his hands clasped behind his back. The silence stretched again, not cold this time, but unsure. "Alive. I lost a son," he said suddenly, the words emerging like stones pulled from the bottom of a deep well. "He was 5. She looked at him then, fully. The lines in her brow softened, and in that moment she was not a maid, she was not a servant. She was a mother who knew. "I'm sorry," she said, "so am I." Neither spoke of names, neither spoke of years or graves or the cruelty of the rain. Outside, the wind had picked up. The candle in his hand bent slightly as a draught touched it. He stepped forward and set it on the mantel, beside the clock that had not ticked in years. She watched his hand. It was strong, veined, steady, and yet it trembled just slightly as he withdrew it. The moment was fragile, suspended between them like breath on glass. "I will leave you to your work," he said at last. She nodded, though her hands did not move to sweep. They hung at her sides, quiet and bare. He walked past her then, slowly, with the weight of someone choosing not to look back. But just before he reached the door, he paused. "Miss Hartwell." "Yes, Your Grace." He did not turn, only spoke. "Sometimes the scar that does not ache is the one we should worry about most." And then he was gone. Isabel stood alone in the flickering firelight, the coal dust clinging to her skirts, her fingers still resting near the place where the flame had touched her skin. She did not move. She could not. Something had cracked. Not in the walls, not in the hearth, but within her. And though it made no sound, she felt it completely. The storm came without warning. It rose in the east with the fury of a season long denied, sweeping across the flat Norfolk fields with dark wings and the roar of old gods. By the time it reached Winthorpe Hall, the sky had become a slate-grey canvas, torn open by streaks of white fire and the low, trembling moan of thunder. Rain fell not in drops, but in furious sheets that battered windows, flooded stone gutters, and carved rivulets into the once gravelled paths. Inside the hall, candles fluttered nervously, and the staff moved with quiet haste. Fires were stoked, doors latched, and shutters drawn tight. Mistress Vellum strode through the corridors like a ship's captain bracing against a gale, her black skirts rustling like sails. Isabel Hartwell worked in the linen chamber that evening, her fingers raw from starch and steam. Her sleeves rolled above the elbow, exposing skin marked by labor and time. The thick scent of soap and damp cotton clung to her, along with a silence that weighed heavier than the thunder. She had not seen Thomas since morning. He had remained in the servants' quarters that day, drowsy and pale. His laughter, so bright, so unrepentant, had been absent at breakfast. He had barely touched his porridge. And when she kissed his forehead before heading to her duties, she had felt the unmistakable heat of a rising fever. Still, she obeyed. She had no choice. By late afternoon, worry had become a tight knot in her stomach. By nightfall, it had twisted into something unmanageable. She folded a towel without looking at it, her mind no longer present. And then came the voice. "Miss Hartwell, the West Gallery floor still bears your muddy prints. See that it is cleaned before the bells." Mistress Vellum's words sliced through the chamber like a blade dulled by use but still capable of harm. Isabel curtsied slightly. "Yes, mistress." But her hands did not move. Her heart was already elsewhere. A flash of lightning lit the hallway beyond. Rain hammered the windows, drowning out all but the loudest sounds. And beneath it all, she thought she heard, perhaps imagined, a thin, broken cry. Her son's voice, weak, frightened. She hesitated no more. Without asking leave, without even removing her apron, Isabel darted from the chamber and down the narrow servants' stairwell, her shoes slipping on the wet stone. The hem of her skirt caught on the balusters, tearing slightly, but she did not stop. She ran. The door to the small quarters she shared with Thomas creaked as she threw it open. He lay twisted on the cot, sweat beading along his forehead, his breath shallow and quick. His cheeks, flushed and blotchy, burned with fever. His small hands clutched the blanket weakly, and his eyes, normally so wide and watchful, fluttered in and out of focus. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Thomas," she whispered, pressing a hand to his brow. "My darling, no." He moaned faintly, leaning into her touch. "No one came?" she asked, more to herself. "No one noticed?" There was no answer, only the storm. Isabel stripped the blanket from him and reached for a damp cloth, her hands trembling as she cooled his neck and chest. His breaths came in short bursts. Every second passed like a verdict. "I'm here," she whispered over and over. "Mama's here. I won't leave you." But even as she said it, the truth clawed at her throat. She had left him. Not by choice, not willingly, but she had left, and this was the cost. A rustling behind her made her turn. She had not heard the door open. Alaric Winthorpe stood just inside the threshold, his black cloak soaked through, the edges dripping steadily onto the flagstone. The flickering light from the wall sconce caught his face, drawn, pale, sharp, with an emotion far too raw to be named. For a moment, neither moved. Then he stepped forward. "He is ill," she said hoarsely, voice frayed. I was told to clean the gallery. I begged permission, but she did not grant it," he finished for her. "No." She turned her eyes back to her son, brushing damp curls from his temples. He stirred faintly, murmuring a half-word lost to fever. Alaric lowered himself beside the bed, not close, not near enough to touch, but near enough to see. The boy's skin was hot, nearly burning, his lips were dry, his breath wheezing slightly with each exhale, but it was not the symptoms alone that seized Alaric's chest in a grip of steel. It was the eyes. Even clouded by fever, Thomas's eyes, hazel, ringed in green and flecked with gold, pierced through the storm. They were not hers. They were not even fully the boy's. They were familiar, as was the shape of the chin, the slight cleft in the center, the soft curve of the jaw. Alaric stared, not in judgment, but in dawning recognition. He had seen those features before, in portraits that lined his family's study, in the mirror years ago, in a child who once rode on his shoulders beneath the summer sun. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "I'll send for Dr. Gray." Isabel looked up sharply. You'd call a physician? He will come quickly. He owes me a favor." "But he's for the family." Alaric met her gaze. There, in the dimness, surrounded by the scent of sweat and thunder and damp stone, he saw the truth written in her face, the fear of a mother, the pride of a woman who had suffered and refused to bend, the shame of one who had asked for nothing and yet could no longer refuse. "I will call him anyway." She nodded, unable to speak. Within the hour, the physician arrived. Alaric himself opened the great front door to admit him, ignoring the shock on the man's face at the sight of his once-absent host. The storm continued to rage as Dr. Gray examined the boy, issued instructions, and left medicines behind. Tinctures, powders, cloths to be soaked and reapplied every hour. Isabel worked tirelessly through the night, refusing sleep. And though he said little, Alaric returned more than once to the door, watching from the shadows. Not for her, not only for the boy, but for something he did not yet understand. By morning, the fever had broken. Thomas slept deeply, his breath finally even, his lashes dark against his cheeks. Isabel sat at the edge of the bed, exhausted beyond measure. Mistress Vellum found her there shortly after sunrise. The housekeeper's mouth was pressed in a firm line, her eyes cold. "You abandoned your post." "I did." "You were seen with his grace." "I was. There will be consequences." Isabel stood slowly, steadying herself. "Then let them come." She turned, eyes weary but fierce. And behind her, in the dark recesses of the corridor, Alaric stood once more, watching. And this time, he did not hide. The morning that brought Lord Berwick to Winthorpe Hall was too bright for comfort. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of polished blue and a crispness in the air that seemed to mock the unease still lingering within the manor's walls. The gravel paths were slick with dew, the hedgerows glistening, and yet no one ventured outside unless duty required it. The house breathed with tension, subtle and pressing, like the silence before a blade is drawn. Isabel Hartwell moved through the garden with measured steps, her apron damp at the hem from brushing against rosemary bushes and early spring blossoms. She carried a basket of fresh linens, just laundered and hung beneath the eaves to dry, her eyes focused on her task. It was the only part of the estate where she could still breathe, among soil and sunlight, far from glances too lingering and whispers too sharp. Thomas, now recovered, played a short distance away beneath the arch of the old pear tree. He sat cross-legged, carving shapes into the soft earth with a stick, humming to himself. His color had returned, his energy nearly full again, but the weight in Isabel's chest had not lifted. She kept one eye on him always. She did not see the gentleman approaching until his voice reached her back. "Well, this is what has become of Winthorpe Hall. A duke's garden, turned to mud under a servant's feet." She turned. The man before her was tall, polished and cruel in the way only those who believe themselves untouchable could be. His doublet was cut in the latest London fashion, his beard meticulously trimmed, and his signet ring flashed in the morning light as he reached for a handkerchief to dab at the non-existent dust on his gloves. "Lord Berwick," Isabel said quietly, offering a faint curtsy. "You know my name. I'm not surprised." He stepped closer, his smile sharp. "It seems you know many things not proper for a girl of your station." "I know my work, my place, and my name," she answered. "That is enough." "Is it?" He glanced toward the boy, then back to her. "Because from where I stand, it seems you know a great deal more than that. You know how to climb, Miss Hartwell, with silence, with skirts soaked in sympathy." Her hands clenched at her sides. "I do not understand you, my lord. Don't you?" He circled her slowly, voice low and poised like a serpent's coil. "Come now. A child born from sin, a father unseen, and now the Duke himself sending for physicians in the dead of night. What are you exactly?" Before she could answer, before she could even think to move, a voice cut the air like steel through silk. "She is under my protection." The words came from behind. Lord Berwick turned, his face tightening. Alaric Winthrop stood at the garden's edge, dressed in black as always, but with no cloak, no gloves, only the fire in his eyes and the thunder in his posture. His hands were bare, fists already clenched. There was no hesitation in his stride, no nobility in his silence. He moved with fury kept tightly leashed. "My lord," Berwick said, attempting civility, "I merely—" "You spoke to her as if she were filth beneath your boots," Alaric interrupted. "You forget yourself." "She's a servant," Berwick said, "and a dangerous one at that. Look how she stares at you. Look how easily she's twisted your judgment." Alaric's voice dropped. "Say another word." Berwick smirked. "You'll strike me. Over a maid. Over—" The sound echoed before it registered. Alaric's fist collided with Berwick's jaw in a single, decisive motion. The nobleman staggered back, nearly slipping in the damp grass, one hand flying to his face, the other fumbling for balance. Blood welled at the corner of his lip, vivid against his pale skin. "Leave my land," Alaric said coldly. "Now!" Berwick spat to the side. "You've lost your mind." "No, I have only found the line, and you crossed it." The silence afterward was deafening. The wind held its breath. Even the trees seemed to still. Berwick turned without another word, retreating toward the house with as much dignity as one could muster, with blood trickling down the chin. He did not look back. Alaric stood motionless for a long moment. Then he looked at Isabel. She had not moved. Her arms clutched the basket so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her lips were parted, her breath caught somewhere between astonishment and fear. "My apologies," he said. "You should never have been spoken to in that way." She shook her head. "It wasn't your fault, but I allowed him to enter this house," he murmured. "And that I will not forget." Isabel turned slightly, her gaze flicking to her son, who was watching them now with quiet, wide eyes. "I should go," she said softly. "Please, Your Grace, let me take Thomas and leave Winthrop." "No." His voice was soft, but unyielding. She looked at him again, more sharply this time. "He isn't safe. You saw that. You saw what men like that can do with only their tongues. Which is why I will not allow him to harm either of you. You cannot protect us from what will be said," she said, voice trembling. "Not forever. You are a duke. I am—" "You are a woman of dignity, and that child is yours, which is reason enough for me." He stepped closer, eyes locked to hers. "Stay." The word hung between them, not a command, but a plea. Isabel looked down at the grass. Her breath came slowly, unevenly. Her body trembled not from fear, but from the strain of knowing what her heart wanted and what the world would demand of her. I need time," she whispered. He nodded once. "Then take it." That evening, the entire manor was abuzz. Servants passed news like wine at a feast. The Duke had struck a guest, a nobleman, in defense of a maid. Some said it was madness. Others said it was prophecy, and a few, those with softer eyes, said it was something else entirely. Mistress Vellum said nothing, but in the quiet of her chamber she penned a letter in long, looping script. The wax seal bore the mark of her old mistress's family, one that carried weight in drawing-rooms far beyond Norfolk. She addressed it to Lady Eugenia Berwick, a widow of sharp tongue and sharper memory, and she would arrive by the next sundown. The air in the north wing of Winthrop Hall was always colder than the rest. The windows there had not been opened in years, and the dust settled with the authority of time. The walls bore portraits no longer admired, and the floor creaked under steps that seldom passed. Few servants liked to venture into that wing, especially not alone, for it was said the past lived there, not in ghosts but in papers, in ink, in names half erased, and stories no longer told. It was there that Isabel Hartwell found herself that morning, a rag in one hand and a brass key in the other, given by the steward with a mumbled command. "Clean the ledger room, the Duchess's old archives. No need to read, just dust and lock it again." But Isabel was not a girl to obey blindly. Not anymore. She entered the room, and closed the door behind her with quiet purpose. The smell of old paper and dried wax met her nose instantly, and the dust swirled in the golden shafts of light that slipped through the shutters like reluctant memories. The ledger room was small and square, with shelves on all four walls, filled not with books, but boxes, ledgers, documents bundled in faded ribbons. A writing desk stood near the window, its surface covered with receipts, tenant lists, and correspondences dating back decades. On the wall, an old tapestry hung, faded blue lilies upon a field of rust. The room felt untouched by grief, as though time itself had hesitated to cross its threshold. Isabel removed her apron and rolled her sleeves. Her hands, though roughened by years of toil, moved with surprising gentleness as she began to lift the ledgers one by one, brushing off the dust, aligning them with care. It was a rhythm that quieted the mind, until her fingers landed on something that did not belong. A slim ledger, bound in burgundy leather, its spine cracked but its clasp intact. It bore no title, just a single golden W. The clasp opened easily. Inside, she found a list of names, dates, dowries, births, and then she saw it. A woman's name, written in a fine, deliberate hand, Genevieve Ainsley Winthorpe. Beside it, a date of birth, and beneath, a single line scrawled hastily in darker ink, removed by request of the Duke. The line had been crossed out, but the ink bled through still, like a wound that refused to fade. Another entry, half a page later. Edward Winthorpe, died aged 5. Not titled, not registered in heraldic succession. Her breath caught. This was the child. His child. Buried, without title, denied even his place in the family lineage, a ghost behind veils of propriety. She turned another page, a letter tucked within. It was from the Duchess, a farewell. A cry of the heart inked in trembling script. You loved me, but not enough to save him, and I cannot stay in a house that forgets its children. Isabel closed the book gently, her fingers trembling. She now understood why Alaric Winthorpe lived in silence. She now knew what the rain could not wash away. Outside the room, footsteps echoed. She turned, slipped the book back into place, wiped her hands on her apron, and reached for her rag once more. Her breath came in shallow waves, but her face betrayed nothing. The next hours passed in uneasy calm. Isabel returned to her regular duties, her mind still clinging to the names she had read. She carried tea trays, folded linens, fetched water from the well. But the hall was no longer just a house to her. It was a graveyard of secrets, and she walked among the tombstones. By late afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. The arrival of Lady Eugenia Berwick cast a new chill over Winthorpe. Her carriage pulled into the courtyard under a veil of early mist, her footman rigid, her hat plume stiff with starch. She descended like judgment itself, tall, austere, dressed in purple silks edged with black lace, her face carved from ice and pride. The widow of a viscount, sister to Lord Berwick, and a woman who had never forgotten a slight. She said little to the Duke upon her arrival, only offered a curt nod and a meaningful glance toward Mistress Vellum, who awaited her like a priestess before an altar. That evening, whispers began to circle the manor like vultures. A brooch was missing, a valuable one, jeweled, gilded, and last seen in Lady Eugenia's possession, an heirloom of her husband's family, worth more than all the wages paid to the servants in a year. The accusation did not take long to take form. By dusk, 2 constables from Norwich stood in the entry hall, their boots wet with travel, their expressions unreadable. They carried with them an official seal, a search order, and a quiet air of menace. Isabel was summoned to the servants' hall. She came calmly, her skirts neatly pressed, her hair tucked behind her ears, her heart beating fast enough to deafen her. The head constable turned toward her. Miss Isabel Hartwell, we have received credible information that a piece of property belonging to the Honourable Lady Eugenia Berwick has been taken. We are to search your quarters. She blinked. You may search what you please. They did. The brooch was found beneath her cot, wrapped in linen. She stared at it as though it had grown there. Lady Eugenia's voice sliced through the tension like polished steel. That is my property. There is no doubt. Mistress Vellum stepped forward solemnly. "I saw her pass near my chamber not 2 days past. She carries herself quietly, your grace, too quietly." Isabel turned to Alaric. He stood near the staircase, one hand on the balustrade, his eyes wide with disbelief. But he said nothing. Nothing. "Your grace?" she said softly, a whisper that barely left her throat. "You know this is not mine. You know I—" But the constable stepped forward, binding her wrists with a strip of cloth. "You are to come with us, miss, until a formal inquiry is made." "Please," she said, twisting toward the boy who now stood frozen near the edge of the corridor. "Please, let me hold him just once. Please." But they did not listen. Thomas began to cry, an open, ragged cry that tore through the halls like a lamentation. "Mama! Mama!" Alaric's hand gripped the banister so tightly the wood groaned beneath it. But still, he did not move. He did not speak. He did not stop them. Isabel's eyes met his as they pulled her through the archway. There was no hatred in her gaze, no fear, only heartbreak, and silence, and something final. The courtroom in Norwich was a somber chamber of timber and stone, where justice wore the cold face of ritual and mercy rarely crossed its threshold. The high windows let in a sallow light, dust dancing like ash in the stale air. Rough benches lined the gallery, and at the front, a long wooden table stood before the magistrate's chair, like an altar before a silent god. Isabel Hartwell sat on the right side of the table, her hands folded in her lap, wrists no longer bound, but marked faintly from the cloth that had tied them. She wore her work dress, the brown kirtle faded from washing, her apron clean but worn. Her hair was tied back in its modest coif, and her face, though pale, remained composed, almost serene. If she was afraid, it did not show. Around her, murmurs flitted like birds disturbed from their nests. Townspeople, minor gentry and a few hired onlookers filled the seats, eager to witness the spectacle of a fallen servant accused of theft in a noble household. Among them sat Lady Eugenia Berwick, veiled in black lace like a grieving widow at a funeral she herself had arranged. Her lips did not move, but her presence was loud. Mistress Vellum sat 2 rows behind, stiff-backed, her hands gloved, her gaze unwavering. Alaric Winthorpe had not yet arrived. The magistrate, a stern man with greying hair and eyes dulled by years of verdicts, adjusted his spectacles and glanced over the parchment before him. "Miss Hartwell," he began, his voice echoing faintly against the stone, "you are charged with the theft of a jewelled brooch, property of Lady Eugenia Berwick, last seen within the guest chambers of Winthorpe Hall. The item was discovered wrapped in linen beneath your cot. Do you deny possession of the item?" "I do," she said calmly, her voice clear, unwavering. "I did not take it. I have never touched it." "Then how do you account for its appearance in your quarters?" "I cannot," she replied simply, "only that it was not placed there by me." The magistrate raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting another servant placed it there, or perhaps a guest?" "I suggest only that I am not its thief." Lady Eugenia shifted in her seat, the faint rustle of her silks slicing through the silence. The magistrate looked to her. "My lady," he said, "do you wish to speak?" She rose slowly, one hand resting dramatically against her breast. "The brooch," she began, "was a wedding gift from my husband's mother. It bears our family crest, as any here may attest. I removed it only briefly from my trunk during my second evening at the hall, when I intended to wear it to supper. I returned it before dressing. The next morning it was gone." She turned her gaze directly to Isabel. "I have long been warned that generosity toward staff is not always wise. Some see kindness as invitation, others as weakness." Gasps rippled through the benches. Isabel's gaze remained forward. Her face betrayed no injury. The magistrate nodded. "Thank you, Lady Eugenia." He glanced again toward the rear of the chamber. Still no sign of the Duke. He returned his attention to the accused. "Miss Hartwell, do you have any witnesses to vouch for your character?" Isabel hesitated, and then shook her head. "No, only my word." The magistrate sighed. "And does His Grace intend to speak on your behalf?" A hush fell over the room, but the door remained closed, and the silence answered for him. The magistrate leaned back in his chair. "Very well. The court." The door creaked open. Heads turned. Alaric Winthrop entered, clad not in black, but in a deep navy coat embroidered with faint silver threads, the color of storm clouds over moonlight. His gloves were removed, his hair slightly windswept, as though he had come not from the manor, but from battle. He walked slowly to the front, nodding once toward the magistrate. "My apologies," he said, voice like gravel softened by time. "There was a letter I had to read before I spoke." The magistrate nodded. "You are not obliged to testify, Your Grace." "But I will," he replied. He turned then and faced her. Isabel's breath caught. Her fingers curled tightly in her lap. He looked not at the court, nor at the crowd, but at her, only her. "I have known Miss Hartwell as a servant in my house for over a year," he began. "She has raised her son with dignity, performed her duties with discipline, and never once have I seen in her the heart of a thief." Lady Eugenia scoffed quietly. Alaric's eyes shifted toward her. "And if I must speak plainly, I shall. That brooch was not found by chance. It was planted, and it was not the first injustice this woman has endured beneath my roof." The magistrate lifted a hand. "Do you have proof of this claim, Your Grace?" Alaric paused, then withdrew from his coat a folded parchment, sealed with wax. "This letter," he said, "was written by my steward. It concerns a guest who stayed at Winthrop Hall 6 years ago, my cousin, Edmund Blackley." He turned again to Isabel. "Miss Hartwell, you may recognize the name." Isabel's lips parted, but she said nothing. Alaric continued. "Edmund has returned from the continent. In his letter, my steward confirms that Edmund boasted of a dalliance with a maid during his stay. A woman he discarded, knowing the consequences would fall on her alone. He even recalled her name." He faced the magistrate again. "And though the letter does not concern the brooch, it concerns motive. It concerns character, and it speaks of the long-standing cruelty with which this woman has been treated by those who believe their blood allows them to injure others without cost." A heavy silence blanketed the chamber. The magistrate adjusted his spectacles. "You are not accusing your cousin of placing the brooch?" "No," Alaric said. "I accuse him of placing a child in this world and leaving him unnamed. And I accuse others," his eyes flicked briefly toward Lady Eugenia, "of finding any means to silence the woman who dared raise him." A murmur rose in the gallery, some in disbelief, others in recognition. Alaric stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. "I have failed her already," he said, "but I will not fail her again." Isabel's throat tightened. She could not breathe, not properly, not fully. For once, she allowed the emotion to reach her eyes. The magistrate cleared his throat. "This case concerns a brooch, not a child." Alaric nodded. "Then look closely at motive, my lord. A woman of no wealth, no title, no reason to endanger the home that shelters her son, versus a woman whose pride is louder than her conscience." The magistrate turned to his scribes. "Struck from the record," he muttered. "No formal charges to proceed." The gavel hit the bench, and the room exhaled. But Isabel did not stand. She looked at Alaric. He had saved her, but he had also been silent when she had needed him most. And no words, not yet, could undo the weight of that silence. She rose, slowly, her movements graceful, deliberate, and without curtsying, without thanking him aloud, she turned and left the courtroom, her dignity intact, and her heart undecided. The morning after the trial, the wind over Winthrop Hall shifted. It carried with it not the scent of dew or spring blossoms, but something sharper, unrest, the kind of unrest that stirred behind drawn curtains, that whispered through parlor doors and set teacups trembling in their saucers. Servants glanced at each other with new caution. The master had changed. The silence they had grown accustomed to now pulsed with something unexpected. Action. Alaric Winthrop stood in his private study, where heavy beams crossed the ceiling and firelight flickered against rows of law books and hunting trophies long neglected. His coat lay across the back of a chair. He wore only his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, the collar slightly open, as if breath came easier without formality. In front of him, at a table lined with documents, sat Edmund Blackley, his cousin, his heir, and the man who had done what Alaric himself had never dared, ruin a woman without bearing the weight of it. Edmund, with his polished boots propped carelessly against the leg of the table, sipped from a goblet of claret with the leisure of a man who believed himself untouchable. "So this is what it's about," he drawled, swirling the wine lazily. "The maid, the child, the brooch. You've woven quite the drama, Alaric. One might think you had a heart beating beneath that stone chest of yours." Alaric's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "You will write the confession." Edmund chuckled. "Confession of what? Bedding a pretty girl who looked at me like I was the sun? Oh, cousin, don't be sanctimonious. It was 6 years ago. She knew what it was. They always do." "She was 17, Alaric said, his voice low, "and in my house, under my protection. And yet I don't recall you protecting her then." Edmund shot back with a smirk. "It's easy to be noble when the damage has already been done." The words struck deep. Alaric walked slowly to the desk, placed his hands flat upon the wood, and leaned in until their eyes were level. "You seduced her. You left her with a child. And then you let your sister and a bitter servant try to destroy what dignity she had left. You will write the confession." Edmund raised an eyebrow, amused. "And if I don't?" Alaric reached into the drawer and withdrew a sealed letter, the steward's testimony, detailing Edmund's own drunken boasting, his written accounts of his time abroad, and his signature on the guest ledger from 6 years prior. "I will bring this to the magistrate," Alaric said. "I will bring it to the crown, if necessary. I may fall, Edmund, but I will drag your name into the mud with mine." For the first time, Edmund's expression shifted. He lowered his goblet. "And you would do this for a servant?" "No," Alaric replied, "for my son." A silence stretched between them. It was Edmund who looked away first. He reached for the quill. By mid-afternoon, the confession was signed, sealed, and stored. But Alaric Winthorpe did not rest. He rode to Norwich alone, his coat whipping behind him, his gloves stained with ink and sweat. He arrived at the courthouse unannounced, and when he stepped into the chamber, it was not a duke who entered. It was a man, worn but certain. The magistrate glanced up in mild surprise, then slowly nodded. "Your Grace, I wish to make a statement for the record," Alaric said. "Regarding Miss Hartwell's case?" "Yes." The room was empty but for the magistrate and a clerk. No audience, no judgment, only words and their power. "I was wrong," Alaric began, his voice clear, "not in defending her, but in the years before, when I allowed silence to rot the walls of my home. When I let men like Edmund Blackley do as they pleased without consequence. When I let a woman be destroyed because I could not bear to confront the truth." He reached into his coat, withdrew the confession, and laid it on the table. "My cousin, Edmund Blackley, seduced Miss Hartwell under my roof and abandoned her. The child she bore is his. The theft of the brooch was orchestrated by Lady Eugenia Berwick and facilitated by my housekeeper, Mistress Vellum, as retribution. This is not rumor, this is fact." The magistrate glanced at the seal. "This is his signature?" "Yes." "And you wish this added to the case?" "No," Alaric said. "I wish this to close the case." He stepped back, inhaled deeply, and then, with the solemnity of a man carrying a wound he would never fully speak of, he added, "I must also confess something else." The magistrate blinked. "Go on." "It was I who failed to secure the south gate 5 years ago," Alaric said, his voice growing quieter. "My son, Edward, slipped through it during the early rain. He wandered into the woods. I was to return within the hour, but I delayed for a hunt. I never found him alive." The room fell silent. The clerk's pen stilled. "I did not bury a child," Alaric continued. "I buried guilt, and I let that guilt rule me, until I saw a boy dancing in the rain, and a woman who had every reason to curse the world smile as though it had never wronged her." He looked away, briefly. "I thought I had no more tears to shed," he whispered, "but I was wrong again." The magistrate leaned back slowly. After a long pause, he said simply, "This court thanks you, your grace. All charges against Miss Hartwell shall be struck from record, her name cleared, her honor restored." Alaric closed his eyes. He said nothing more. That night, the news returned to Winthorpe ahead of him. The constables delivered it first, then the steward, then whispers. In the servants' hall, jaws dropped. In the nursery, Thomas was told with careful gentleness that his mother would return. Mistress Vellum packed in silence, and Lady Eugenia left at first light. But in one chamber, in one narrow, cold, rented room above the apothecary's shop, Isabel Hartwell sat by candlelight, the flame trembling as though it shared her unrest. A knock came at the door. She did not rise. She already knew. He stood on the threshold, rein on his shoulders, his hat in his hands. And for once his title did not enter with him, only the man. The rain returned with a quiet insistence. It did not arrive in violence as it had that night weeks ago, when lightning split the sky and fear clung to every heartbeat. No, this time it came like memory, steady, soft, inescapable. It slid down the leaded glass of Winthorpe Hall like tears that would not fall, soaking the hedges, pooling along the garden paths, filling the crevices between flagstones long forgotten. The house, too, was changed. Mistress Vellum was gone, dismissed without ceremony, her belongings packed by another's hands. Lady Eugenia had departed in the dawn, her carriage wheels carving tracks in the mud as sharp as her words. Whispers no longer ruled the corridors, though they lingered like perfume in the tapestries. Servants now glanced more freely toward the master's study, uncertain but hopeful. Something had broken, or perhaps something had bloomed. But the room that mattered most was now empty. Isabel had not returned. Though her name had been cleared, though her dignity restored before the law, she had chosen not to return to Winthorpe. The manor was quiet without her. No footsteps echoing in the gallery, no faint lullaby drifting from the nursery, no soft voice at the break of day asking if Thomas had eaten, if his shoes were dry, if the woodpile needed restocking. Alaric felt her absence like a wound beneath cloth, hidden but aching. He stood by the window in the west wing, the same one from which he had first seen her dance in the rain. But now the garden below was not shrouded in sorrow. It was simply wet. The rosemary bush sagged under droplets. The pear tree's limbs swayed gently. Weeds still crept between the bricks, and the fountain no longer flowed. But the land breathed again. He watched the downpour with hands tucked behind his back, chin tilted slightly downward. The fire at his back did little to warm him. What warmth he sought could not be found in embers. He turned away at last, and walked, down the long hallway with its faded portraits, past the grand stairwell with its polished banister, through the narrow servants' door that led into the side garden, where no nobleman had stepped in years. Rain greeted him like an old companion. It soaked him instantly, his hair, his collar, his sleeves. The path beneath his boots turned slick, and the cold reached his spine with fingers that once would have driven him back inside. But he kept walking. He passed the old shed, the rusted gate, the twisted rose bush that had not bloomed since his wife died. The garden had once been her pride, orderly, fragrant, alive. Now it bore the scars of neglect. And yet, through the rain, small green shoots pushed against the earth, stubborn and unseen. Alaric reached the center path and stopped. Here, this was where she had spun with her son. This was where laughter had dared to challenge grief. He removed his gloves and let them fall. Rain traced the lines of his face, touched the creases beside his eyes, softened the edge of his mouth. He closed his eyes and let it touch him, let the sky weep for what he could not say. Behind him, footsteps approached, light, uneven. He turned. Thomas stood a few feet away beneath the arched trellis, his curls damp, cheeks pink from the chill, and boots caked in mud. He wore his little brown coat, the sleeves slightly too long, and a knitted cap that sagged to one side. "Your Grace?" the boy asked, uncertain. Alaric straightened slightly. "Thomas," the boy hesitated. "Mama said I wasn't to bother you." "You're not bothering me." Thomas bit his lip. His eyes, always too old for his years, searched Alaric's face. "Are you sad?" The question struck deeper than it should have. Alaric knelt on the damp grass without hesitation, ignoring the water that now seeped through his trousers. "I have been," he said honestly, "for a long time." "Because of your boy?" Thomas asked, tilting his head. Alaric nodded once. Thomas stepped forward slowly. His limp made him sway slightly like a branch resisting wind. He stopped in front of Alaric and looked at him for a long moment. Then very quietly he asked, "Would you teach me to ride, like real riding, with a saddle and reins and everything?" Alaric blinked, startled not by the question, but by how quickly it softened the ache in his chest. "If your mother allows it," he said gently. "I'd be honored." Thomas grinned, teeth slightly crooked, joy unfiltered. "I'll ask her," he said. "She'll say no, but maybe this time she won't." He turned to go, but paused. "Even if you're sad," he said over his shoulder, "you're not scary anymore." Alaric watched him limp back through the archway, the boy's coat flapping like a banner in the rain. Not scary anymore. The word struck him harder than any accusation had. He sat back onto the stone bench, drenched, heart loud in his chest, and smiled. Not with his mouth, but with his soul. Far from the manor, in a modest cottage at the edge of the woods, Isabel stood at the window watching the same rain. It drummed against the roof like a lullaby and painted streaks across the glass that blurred the trees outside. Her hands, still red from scrubbing, rested against the sill. The fire behind her crackled gently. Thomas's boots were drying by the hearth. She had heard nothing yet, no messenger, no footsteps on the path, and still she knew. Something had changed. In the silence of the cottage, she allowed herself a rare luxury. She cried, not from fear, not from pain, but from something older, deeper, older even than loss. She cried from hope, the kind that bruises before it heals, the kind that whispers in spite of all evidence, "What if?" She wiped her cheek and turned back toward the fire. Her eyes lingered on the pair of boots by the flames, small, worn, and waiting. Just like her, the frost had begun to recede. Not in sudden thaw, but gently, like a breath released after too long held. The grounds of Winthorpe Hall, once locked in winter's sorrow, slowly stirred beneath the warming sun. Crocuses bloomed beside cracked stones. Vines crept cautiously up the trellises once abandoned to rot. The soil, dark, fragrant, forgiving, received each new seed as if it remembered what it meant to hope. In the center of the garden, the Duke knelt. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, his hands covered in earth. Dirt caked beneath his nails, and sweat dampened the collar of his linen shirt. Alaric Winthorpe had long since cast off the gloves of ceremony, the trappings of grief. He did not garden like a nobleman overseeing labor. He worked like a penitent, like a man tilling the ruins of his own soul. The roses had been the first to return, then the lavender, then the wild thyme his wife had once planted along the northern wall, the one Isabel's skirts had brushed when she twirled in the rain with her son. He found comfort in the rhythm. Dig, press, water, breathe. The earth did not ask him to speak. It did not remind him of mistakes or expect grand speeches. It welcomed him without question. It was late morning when he rose at last, wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, and stood quietly among the beds. His breath clouded lightly in the cool air. Behind him, the manor loomed still and watchful. But today, he would not remain within its walls. His horse was saddled by his own hand, the journey made without escort. He rode not in finery, but in a simple wool coat, the color of storm-touched sky, and carried nothing with him but a letter in his breast pocket and a single gold ring tucked in a velvet pouch. The road to Isabel's cottage curved through the edge of the woods, where branches arched above like cathedral rafters. Spring had begun to crown them in pale green buds. Birds moved in pairs, their calls echoing in the quiet. When he reached the clearing, the cottage stood in sunlight, smoke curling from the chimney, a shawl pinned on the lines swaying with the breeze. The door was closed, but not bolted. He dismounted and approached on foot, his boots sinking softly into the moss beneath the stone step. He knocked once. No answer. He waited. Then the door opened. Isabel stood in the threshold, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a basket of herbs at her hip. Her hair was loosely braided with tendrils escaping around her face. Her expression, when she saw him, did not soften. Not yet. "Your Grace," she said quietly. "I was hoping," he replied gently, "you might call me Alaric." A pause, then, "You've come far." "Not far enough," he answered. She stepped aside without speaking, allowing him into the small room warmed by the fire. The scent of rosemary and bread filled the space. On the table, a bowl of peeled apples waited. A wooden toy horse lay by the hearth, its leg broken and mended. She did not ask why he had come. She waited. He looked at her, not with yearning, not with apology, but with purpose. "I will not ask for forgiveness," he said, "because I do not deserve it. I will not ask you to forget because you should not, but I have come to offer you something else." She turned slightly, her hand resting on the edge of the table. "I have restored the land," he continued, "not for legacy, not for title, for something that needed tending, like my name, like your trust." She said nothing, but her breath caught faintly. "I have written a deed," he said, removing the folded paper from his pocket and laying it on the table. "A portion of Winthorpe's land, yours, for Thomas, for whatever future you choose." Her eyes flicked to the parchment, but did not reach for it. "I also wrote to a tutor in Cambridge. He has agreed to come twice a month to teach your son. Letters, numbers, history, riding." At this her gaze lifted, her lips parted. "You need not live with me to accept these things," he said. "They are not gifts, they are reparations." "And if I refuse them?" she asked. "Then I will still tend the garden," he said. "And wait," she exhaled. "Isabel," he said at last, softer. "I lost a son because I did not guard the gate. I nearly lost another, though he is not mine by blood, because I did not speak. I have spent too many years silent. I will not spend the rest of them lonely." She blinked. "What are you asking?" He pulled the velvet pouch from his coat, untied the knot, and set the simple ring upon the table. It was not jeweled. It bore no crest. Only a narrow band of gold, worn at the edges from years in a drawer. "I ask," he said, kneeling slowly before her, "for your name beside mine. Not as a servant, not as a debt repaid, but as a woman who stood when I did not, who spoke when I was silent, who fought when I turned away." She stared at the ring, then at him. He did not move. She reached for the ring, touched it lightly. "I once said I would not be pitied," she murmured. "I do not pity you." "No," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "You don't. That's why I will say yes." She set the ring in his hand, and with a voice steadier than she had thought herself capable of, she added, "Because you stood for me, when it cost you everything." They married beneath the arbor in the garden of Winthorpe Hall. There was no fanfare, no orchestra, only a small gathering of those who knew the story and the old rosemary bush in bloom beside them. Isabel wore a gown of ivory linen, her hair swept back with a ribbon Thomas had chosen. Alaric wore no coat of arms, only a dark waistcoat, and a look in his eyes that made the sun itself seem subdued. Thomas walked between them. His limp was still present, but it no longer drew glances, no longer needed explanation. He walked with pride. When the vows were spoken, and hands bound with ribbon, rain began to fall, not in torrents, not in sorrow, but gently, softly, like petals from a tree shaken by spring, and love, at last, fell with it. Quiet, steady, certain. Winthorpe Hall stood tall under the honeyed light of late summer, its stones warmed by years of restoration, its gardens now a living testament to what had once been broken. The air smelled of lavender, thyme, and freshly turned earth. Roses, wild and untamed, spilled from the borders like laughter remembered. A child's kite dipped and soared above the orchard, its red tail trailing joy against a pale blue sky. The past, though never forgotten, had softened. At the edge of the garden, beneath a pear tree that had once watched over a timid little boy and a mother determined to survive, two figures sat close together on a weathered bench. The man, silver now at the temples but strong in posture, held a book in one hand and a child's bonnet in the other. The woman beside him leaned her head lightly to his shoulder, her smile faint but full. Alaric and Isabel Winthorpe. 8 years had passed since the day they exchanged vows in the rain-soaked garden. Time had lined their faces with new stories, but their eyes still spoke in the same language, of gratitude, of gentleness hard-earned, and of a love that had bloomed not from ease, but from endurance. Thomas, now 14, rode his mare across the southern field with the confidence of a young nobleman and the soul of a poet. His limp remained, but it did not define him. It never had. He studied Latin and law with a scholar from Cambridge, and spent his afternoons in the village schoolhouse teaching letters to boys smaller than he once was. And then there was Eleanor, 5 years old, brown curls like her mother's, eyes like storm-washed sky. She had been born one September morning as the first apples ripened on the trees. Her laughter, musical and wild, filled the halls like a hymn. She spoke to plants as if they understood her and insisted on carrying a wooden sword wherever she went. She had Alaric's stubbornness and Isabel's fire. Their home was no longer divided by corridors of silence. It echoed now with footsteps, with voices, with life. The servants no longer whispered about ghosts. They spoke of festivals, of harvests, of the day Lady Winthorpe knelt in the mud beside the cook to dig onions with her bare hands. The village, too, had changed. Winthorpe's tenants had been granted rights to their own land parcels. Girls were taught to read. Mothers received letters addressed to them, not just their husbands. A woman now sat on the council that governed the local trade routes. Her name was Sarah Vellum, niece to the former housekeeper, a woman who had chosen to write a new ending to her family's story, and yet not all names were remembered kindly. Lady Eugenia Berwick, after her fall from favour, fled to London and lived out her days behind high curtains and closed parlour doors. She was never charged, never humiliated, only forgotten, which, to her, may have been the cruelest punishment of all. Edmund Blackley lost his inheritance. Alaric made certain of that. The confession had never reached the crown, but the shame of it followed Edmund like a stain that would not lift. He lived abroad now, drifting, titled but powerless. He never married, and no one ever spoke his name at Winthorpe. On the day of Thomas's 14th birthday, the family hosted a celebration in the garden. No gowns, no lace, just laughter. Cake, overbaked by a well-meaning steward. Lemonade served in mismatched cups. Alaric danced once, with Eleanor standing on his boots, and Isabel laughed so hard she cried. That night, long after the guests had gone and the stars scattered themselves across the sky like promises, Alaric found Isabel sitting in the garden, her shawl draped loosely across her shoulders. He sat beside her, as he always did. "I never believed," she said softly, "that we would come this far." He looked at her, his gaze still reverent after all these years. "Neither did I. I still remember what it felt like to carry everything alone," she whispered. "You never will again," he said, taking her hand. She looked toward the trees, where the wind played through the leaves like fingers across harp strings. "There's a peace now," she said, "not just in the house, in me." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, slowly, silently. The moon rose higher, and the garden, once a place of mourning, then of awakening, now rested in bloom. Not because the past had been rewritten, but because it had been survived. And love, patient and steadfast, had made its home in the space between grief and grace. Sometimes the most beautiful gardens are those that bloom after the storm. Isabel and Alaric's story is not one of perfection. It is a story of scars that healed, of dignity reclaimed, of love that dared to begin after the world had already called it too late. It reminds us that redemption doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in silence broken, in hands dirtied by truth, in the courage to hope again. Perhaps you saw yourself in Isabel's resilience, or in Alaric's silent grief, or in little Thomas, who taught us that even the smallest steps, when taken with love, can change everything. If this story moved you, if it lingered in your heart longer than you expected, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. And if you reached the end with us, write the word bloom below, so I know you stood with these characters until the very last petal. Your presence here means more than words can say. If you'd like to support the team that brings these stories to life, you can send a super thanks with any amount that feels right for you. Every gesture helps us keep telling tales that stir the soul. And if that's not possible today, no worries at all. Just sharing this story with someone you care about already makes a world of difference. Before you go, take a look at the other heartfelt historical romances waiting for you. I've linked them in the cards above. Let yourself be carried away again, and remember, some loves arrive when we least expect them, and stay when we need them the most.